Hello, this is Domenico Composto with EZ NOMICS, and we're going to look at another aspect of exchange rates. In this case, we're going to look at the consequences of changes in exchange rates, particularly the impact of a depreciation in the currency or a devaluation of the currency on key economic indicators such as inflation, economic growth, unemployment. This is a great link on an IB exam between macroeconomics and the global economy unit. So I wouldn't be surprised to see on a paper 2 or paper 3 these links between exchange rates and the impact on a macroeconomy. We're going to use as our applied example the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which was discussed in a previous video when we looked at fixed exchange rates. In that video, we looked particularly at Thailand, and Thailand maintaining a fixed exchange rate between the Thai baht and the US dollar. And in that video, we saw that over time from the 1980s to 1997, the Thai central bank pegged the Thai baht to the US dollar, where one US dollar could buy 25 Thai baht. But in the lead up to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, there was tremendous pressure, downward pressure on the Thai baht. And as the central bank used up all of its foreign exchange reserves, it was no longer able to maintain the peg, and then the currency went into a free float. And once that happened, you could see that that downward pressure led to a dramatic depreciation when it went from fixed to free float of the Thai baht and other currencies as investment was pulling out of the region, the Southeast Asian and East Asian region. Here we can see that, as I mentioned, the Thai baht, one US dollar could buy approximately 25 Thai baht. And then as a result of the Asian financial crisis, one US dollar could buy 41 Thai baht. So in these two particular data points highlights a 40% decrease in the value of the Thai baht versus the US dollar. In terms of GDP, we're going to see that in terms of GDP indicators, the impact of that depreciation, how it can impact real GDP, inflation, unemployment, and so on. And here we can see that in that Asian financial crisis, as investment pulled out of the region for Thailand and other nations that were impacted in this Asian financial crisis, the percent change in GDP decreased into negative territory, essentially recession for these economies. But at the same time, also, you could see that these economies recovered and GDP economic growth rising over time. This Wikipedia page on the 1997 Asian financial crisis highlights some of these macroeconomic indicators as a result of the depreciation in the Thai baht. So, for example, Thailand's booming economy came to a halt in the aftermath of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, leading to massive layoffs. So we see rising unemployment in the finance, real estate, and construction sectors. Migration of workers going back into the countryside looking for work. Here it highlights that the baht's devaluation, it lost more than half of its value. Some firms going into bankruptcy. And so on. But towards the end, it highlights that through that depreciation, Thailand's economy was able to recover. And we're going to look at why. And so over time, it's been appreciating, Thai baht appreciating over time to the US dollar up until 2010. So that's what we're going to take a look at. And we're going to use what we've covered in a previous video. This previous video, we talked about, again, the Central Bank of Thailand and the fixed exchange rate. So I'm going to use that example. So let's get into that. All right. So on the left side here, graph A, we're looking at the market for Thai baht. On the y-axis, we're measuring US dollars per Thai baht. For each Thai baht, how many US dollars can we buy? And as I mentioned, one US dollar could buy 25 Thai baht, or the inverse of that being one Thai baht could buy 0.04 US dollars, or 4 cents, which is my starting point here. The supply of Thai baht the demand for Thai Baht, D1, S1, the equilibrium at point A, establishes an equilibrium exchange rate at E1, 1 Thai Baht equivalent to 4 US cents, with the quantity supply and demanded at Q1. Down here, we see that with the Asian financial crisis, I can make a note, this is the 1997 Asian financial crisis, led to that depreciation of the Thai baht once it went into a free float, where $1, instead of buying 25 Thai baht, can now buy 56 Thai baht, or 1 Thai baht only able to buy 0.017 US dollars, almost 2 cents. So here we can illustrate, as we did before, a depreciation in the value of the currency. So the Thai baht experiencing a fall in demand from D1 to D2. Demand for Thai baht decreasing, and that will take us in the long run to point B, establishing a new equilibrium exchange rate value at E2, which would be equivalent to 0.017 US dollars, 0.017 US dollars. So significant decrease in the value of the currency, decrease in its purchasing power, and the quantity supply and demanded decreasing from Q1 to Q2. So again, this is just a review of that previous video. What we want to do here is understand the consequences of a change in the exchange rate on economic indicators like GDP, inflation, unemployment. So the focus of this particular video is the impact of a depreciation, which would be the same if the central bank was to intentionally devalue the currency. You get the same theoretical impacts on GDP. So again, paper 2, paper 3, you could be looking at an article discussing the change in the exchange rate. And that's a nice link on a paper 2, paper 3 to graph and analyze an exchange rate model that covers unit 4, global economy, but also tying it into unit 3, macroeconomics. So what are the impacts on the macroeconomy of a weaker currency? Now let's take into consideration, all right, let's review a little bit of macro and remember that with a weaker currency, if a country is importing goods and services, inputs and outputs, those imports become more expensive. So let's remember that aggregate demand, AD, aggregate demand, is equal to consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Macro in Unit 3 is predominantly focused on C, I, and G, but global economy is looking at this fourth component of aggregate demand. So what happens when you have a weak currency and your imports become more expensive? All right, SRES, we got to remember, is the sum of all inputs plus outputs that are being produced both domestically and by foreign nations. A country will import inputs and outputs, and that will become part of your aggregate supply curve. It's not only your domestic production along your SRES curve, but it's also the aggregate supply of your imported inputs and outputs. All right, please make a note of that the SRES curve also includes your imported inputs and outputs. So if you have a weaker currency that depreciates, the cost of buying those imported inputs and outputs rises. And what does that mean? It will lead to cost push inflation. So the SRES curve will shift inwards. All right, from SRES 1 to SRES 2. We're going from point C to point D in this case. This is also called imported inflation. You can refer to this type of cost push inflation as imported inflation. So the price level is going to rise while GDP is going to fall. GDP falls from Y1 to Y2 while the price level rises from PL1 to PL2. Okay? Again, depreciation leads to imported inflation. All right, you are importing inputs and outputs that are more costly. So this is imported inflation, which is equivalent to cost push inflation. So the quantity of aggregate demand will decrease along the AD1 curve, or from Y1 to Y2, as people in the domestic macroeconomy are not able to afford those rising prices. All right? Okay, so one consequence of a depreciation or a devaluation of the currency is imports become more expensive. And since the aggregate supply curve is composed of our imported inputs and outputs that become more costly due to the weaker purchasing power of our currency, the SRAS curve shifts inwards from SRAS1 to SRAS2, establishing a new equilibrium where SRAS2 equals 81 at point D, leading to the price level rising, PL1 to PL2, and also leading to GDP falling from Y1 to Y2. So here we've highlighted some economic indicators. There's a rise in inflation and a decrease in real GDP, decrease in the quantity of aggregate demand due to the higher price. Okay? Very good. Now let's also consider what's the impact of depreciation on AD itself, on the aggregate demand curve. Can it shift outward or inward? Yes, a weaker currency means that your exports are becoming cheaper. So again, let's make some notes here. All right, AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So focusing here, you have a weaker currency. With that weaker currency, your imports become very expensive. And because your imports are more expensive, you're not able to buy as much, so we would expect imports to fall. But your domestically produced goods are relatively cheap versus other nations. So if Thailand experiences a reduction in the Thai baht, whatever Thailand exports, which includes tourism is an export, it becomes clear to foreigners, Americans, Europeans, people maybe from Japan, that Thailand is very cheap to vacation in. Maybe other goods produced in Thailand are relatively cheap versus other nations because their currency is so weak. So that will lead to exports rising. So if exports are rising and imports are falling, we would expect that over time that this could become a positive value, and that positive value will cause aggregate demand to shift out, increase demand by foreigners for Thailand's exports. So AD will shift out in the long run from 81 to AD2, from point E to point F, the new equilibrium. That means that there will be an increase in inflation. So here we see demand pull inflation and an increase in real GDP in the export sector of the economy. So price level rises due to the demand pull inflation from PL3 to PL4. And for the firms that export goods and experience an increase in those exports, real GDP will be rising from Y3 to Y4, leading to an increase in the aggregate supply from Y3 to Y4, meaning more employment of resources like land, labor, and capital. So unemployment would be falling here, okay? While unemployment would be rising here. So these are things that you need to consider with depreciation. Keep in mind, again, we're going to summarize depreciation in the currency. We see the Thai baht fall in value. It has weaker purchasing power, meaning that our imported inputs and outputs become more expensive. SRS shifts inwards from SRS1 to SRS2, leading to cost push inflation. We see that the price level is rising from PL1 to PL2, leading to a fall in real GDP from Y1 to Y2, and a decrease in the quantity of aggregate demand from point C to point D. Thus, here, unemployment would be rising. All right. But in graph C, we see that that weaker currency leads to exports rising in the long run as Thailand's exports become the cheaper substitute in the world market, while Thai people reduce their demand for imports because they're so expensive. If exports exceed imports, that causes the AD curve to shift outward from 81 to 82, leading to demand pull, inflation, real GDP rising from Y3 to Y4. That increased aggregate demand by foreigners demanding Thailand's exports leads to more domestic production to meet that demand, and Thai firms are employing more resources like labor, so unemployment is falling from E to F. Okay? So I will provide an outline of these points in the information section below, but that is what it's meant in the potential paper 2, paper 3 question to discuss the consequences of a change in the exchange rate, in this case depreciation, on key macroeconomic indicators. If you have any questions, feel free to post those questions in the comments, and I will also provide another video looking at the impact of an appreciation in the currency. And that's it. Thank you so much.